Sometimes one wrong turn can lead you to the person who changes everything. The Grand Lexington Hotel shimmered beneath thousands of crystal lights as New York's most influential guests arrived for the annual Harrison Foundation Gala. Luxury cars lined the entrance. Photographers captured every smile. Inside the magnificent ballroom, conversations blended with soft music while city leaders, entrepreneurs, and celebrities gathered beneath ceilings decorated with gold accents and elegant chandeliers. Ethan Harrison barely noticed any of it. At 39, the CEO of Harrison Global had attended more high-profile events than he could count. To him, galas had become predictable. Another evening of introductions, speeches, and polite conversations. Another night spent fulfilling expectations. As he moved through the crowd in a tailored black tuxedo, he offered practiced smiles and brief greetings. Everyone wanted a moment of his attention. Very few interested him. Meanwhile, several floors above the ballroom, Ava Mitchell stood inside a preparation suite reviewing sketches spread across a large table. At 31, she was not one of the evening's honored guests. She was part of the creative team responsible for designing several custom pieces featured during the charity fashion presentation later that night. Most attendees would never know her name. That did not bother Ava. She had spent years working quietly, determined to build a future through talent rather than connections. Her dream was simple. One day, she wanted her designs to be recognized on their own merit. The preparation suite buzzed with activity. Assistants moved in and out carrying garment bags. Stylists organized accessories. Designers reviewed final details. After hours of preparation, Ava finally allowed herself a brief moment to breathe. She gathered several sketches and stepped into an adjacent private room reserved for staff use. The evening had been hectic, and she wanted a few minutes of quiet before the presentation began. Back downstairs, Ethan received a message from one of the event coordinators requesting a quick review of a last-minute sponsorship display. Hoping to escape another networking conversation, he welcomed the excuse. Following directions through a maze of hallways and service corridors, he headed toward the upper levels of the hotel. Unfortunately, the directions were not entirely accurate. Several minutes later, Ethan reached a hallway lined with identical doors. He checked his phone again. No signal. The thick walls of the older section of the hotel blocked reception. Sighing softly, he approached what he believed was the correct room and pushed the door open. The moment he stepped inside, he realized his mistake. Ava turned toward the entrance, surprised by the unexpected interruption. She had been preparing for the presentation and adjusting a formal jacket she planned to wear during the event. Nothing inappropriate had occurred, yet the unexpected encounter caught both of them completely off guard. Ethan immediately stepped backward. "I am so sorry," he said at once. "I must have the wrong room." Ava blinked in surprise before a small smile appeared. "I think you do." For a brief second, neither moved. The room seemed strangely still. Golden evening light streamed through nearby windows overlooking Manhattan. Sketches covered the table beside Ava. Her calm expression, her confidence, and the warmth in her eyes stood in sharp contrast to the polished social world Ethan had spent years navigating. Then reality returned. Ethan apologized again and quickly exited into the hallway. The door closed. The encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet as Ethan continued down the corridor searching for the correct room, he found himself thinking about the woman he had just met. And for reasons he could not explain, he already knew one thing. He would not forget her. The gala continued long after Ethan Harrison returned to the ballroom, yet his attention never fully returned with him. Around him, influential guests discussed investments, philanthropy, and expansion projects. Cameras flashed. Glasses clinked softly. Applause rose and faded as speakers took the stage. Normally, Ethan navigated events like these effortlessly. Tonight felt different. More than once, he found himself glancing toward the entrance as though expecting to see someone. The realization annoyed him slightly. He had met the woman for less than a minute. He did not even know her name. Yet her calm smile lingered in his thoughts with surprising persistence. Several floors above, Ava Mitchell reviewed final preparations for the fashion presentation. The unexpected interruption had become a source of quiet amusement among a few colleagues who knew what had happened. Ava, however, quickly moved past it. She had too much work to focus on. Months of preparation had led to this evening, and every detail mattered. As models prepared backstage, Ava checked stitching, adjusted accessories, and reviewed design notes. She cared deeply about her work because every sketch represented years of effort, sacrifice, and determination. Few people understood how many nights she had spent refining ideas after long workdays. Fewer still knew how many opportunities she had turned down because they required compromising her vision. Later that evening, the charity presentation finally began. Guests gathered around the runway while spotlights illuminated the stage. Ethan took his assigned seat near the front row. At first, he paid little attention. Fashion had never been one of his interests. Then the presentation started. Elegant designs appeared one after another beneath the lights. The audience responded enthusiastically. Ethan found himself unexpectedly impressed. The pieces felt different from the luxury collections he usually encountered. They possessed warmth, personality, purpose. Near the end of the presentation, a large screen displayed photographs and sketches showing the creative process behind the collection. One image immediately captured Ethan's attention. Standing beside a table covered with drawings was the same woman from the preparation suite. Her name appeared briefly beneath the photograph. Ava Mitchell. Ethan leaned forward slightly. For the first time that evening, he had an answer to the question that had followed him since the hallway encounter. After the presentation ended, guests rose to applaud. Ethan remained seated for several moments, studying the final images still displayed on the screen. Talent had always interested him. Dedication interested him even more. Something about Ava's work suggested both. Meanwhile, backstage, Ava finally allowed herself to relax. The presentation had been successful. Team members celebrated quietly while organizers congratulated participants. Ava gathered her sketchbook and personal belongings, eager to leave before the evening became even more crowded. As she walked through a quieter section of the hotel, she stopped beside a large window overlooking Manhattan. The city stretched endlessly beneath the night sky. Thousands of lights reflected against the glass. She opened her sketchbook and made a few quick notes about ideas inspired by the presentation. Designing had always helped her process important moments. Unknown to her, Ethan had entered the same corridor moments later while leaving a private meeting. He noticed her immediately, not because she was standing alone beside the window, because she was completely absorbed in creating something. The city sparkled behind her while she focused entirely on the pages before her. Ethan slowed his pace. For reasons he could not explain, curiosity had become something much stronger. And for the first time in many years, he found himself wanting to know the story behind a stranger. A few days after the gala, Ethan Harrison discovered something unusual about himself. He was distracted, not by market fluctuations, board meetings, or international negotiations. Those were challenges he handled every day. What occupied his thoughts now was a woman standing beside a hotel window with a sketchbook in her hands. The realization felt unfamiliar. For years, Ethan had built his life around discipline and control. Emotions rarely influenced his decisions. Yet every time he remembered Ava Mitchell, he found himself wondering what she was drawing, what inspired her designs, and what kind of journey had brought her to that ballroom. Curiosity eventually led him to request additional information about the creative team responsible for the charity presentation. The request seemed harmless enough. As chairman of the foundation, he often reviewed talent involved in major events. Still, when a folder containing designer profiles arrived on his desk, he immediately searched for one name: Ava Mitchell. He opened the file and began reading. The information was surprisingly modest. No famous connections. No prestigious family background. No wealthy investors supporting her career. She had graduated from a design program years earlier and spent most of her professional life working independently while taking freelance projects to support herself. Yet one detail stood out. Nearly every recommendation described her the same way: exceptionally talented, exceptionally dedicated. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared through the windows of his office. The descriptions matched the impression he already carried. There was something authentic about her, something difficult to find in the world he inhabited. Meanwhile, across the city, Ava returned to her normal routine. The excitement surrounding the gala faded quickly. New deadlines arrived. New clients requested revisions. New sketches covered her work table. She rented a small studio space in Brooklyn where creativity mattered more than appearances. The room contained fabric samples, design books, coffee mugs, and dozens of unfinished ideas pinned to walls. It was not luxurious, but it felt like home. One afternoon, while reviewing concepts for a future collection, she received an unexpected email. The Harrison Foundation was organizing a follow-up meeting with selected creative contributors from the gala. Several designers had been invited to discuss future opportunities. Ava read the message twice to make sure she understood correctly. Invitations like this rarely arrived. She accepted immediately. 3 days later, she stepped into Harrison Global Headquarters for the first time. The building rose high above Midtown Manhattan, reflecting sunlight across glass and steel. Everything about the space projected success. Elegant architecture, immaculate interiors, employees moving with purpose. Ava adjusted the strap of her portfolio case and reminded herself to stay focused. She was here because of her work. Nothing else mattered. Upstairs, Ethan reviewed reports while waiting for the meeting to begin. When his assistant informed him that the invited designers had arrived, he felt a reaction he had not expected. Anticipation. He almost laughed at himself. Yet he could not deny it. 20 minutes later, the conference room doors opened. Creative professionals entered one by one carrying portfolios and presentation materials. Then Ava walked into the room. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Recognition appeared instantly. Ava smiled first. A small, polite smile. Ethan returned it. The room filled with conversation as participants took their seats. Neither spoke beyond a simple greeting. Yet something important had changed. The mysterious woman from the hotel hallway was no longer a stranger. And as Ethan noticed the sketchbook resting beside her chair, he had the unmistakable feeling that this meeting was only the beginning of a much larger story. The meeting exceeded everyone's expectations. Designers presented concepts, discussed creative challenges, and explored future collaborations with the Harrison Foundation. Throughout the session, Ethan remained professional and attentive, yet he found himself paying particular attention whenever Ava spoke. Unlike many participants who focused on trends and market opportunities, Ava spoke about people. She described fashion as a form of storytelling, a way for individuals to express confidence, identity, and hope. Her perspective felt refreshingly genuine. When the meeting ended, attendees gathered their portfolios and prepared to leave. Ava carefully packed her sketches into her worn leather case and headed toward the elevator. As she waited, she heard footsteps approaching. Turning slightly, she found Ethan standing nearby. "Your presentation was impressive," he said. Ava smiled politely. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from someone who funds half the projects in this city." Ethan laughed softly. "I think that number gets larger every year." The elevator arrived, but neither stepped inside immediately. For a brief moment, conversation came naturally. They discussed the charity event, creative work, and the challenge of balancing ambition with reality. To Ethan's surprise, speaking with Ava felt effortless. There were no hidden agendas, no attempts to impress him, and no carefully rehearsed compliments. She simply spoke honestly. Before the doors closed, Ethan asked a question. "Do you always carry that sketchbook?" Ava glanced at the notebook tucked beneath her arm. "Almost everywhere." "Why?" She smiled. "Ideas do not follow schedules." The answer stayed with him long after she disappeared into the elevator. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed more frequently. Sometimes it happened through foundation projects. Other times through creative consultations connected to future events. The interactions remained professional, yet each meeting revealed another layer of who Ava was. One afternoon, Ethan visited a design workshop sponsored by the foundation. The space occupied a renovated warehouse in Brooklyn and provided opportunities for emerging artists. While touring the facility, he noticed Ava sitting alone near a large window. Sunlight streamed across dozens of sketches spread over a table. She was completely absorbed in her work. Curious, Ethan approached quietly. Several pages displayed elegant dress concepts unlike anything he had seen before. The designs felt sophisticated, yet deeply personal. Ava noticed him and quickly closed the sketchbook. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Am I not allowed to see?" Ava laughed. "They are unfinished. That usually means they are interesting." After a moment of hesitation, she handed him the notebook. Ethan carefully turned the pages. Each design carried extraordinary detail. More importantly, each sketch seemed connected to a story. Dreams, journeys, transformations. The collection felt alive. "These are remarkable," he said honestly. Ava lowered her eyes. Most people do not think so. Ethan looked up. Then most people are wrong. For a second, the room grew quiet. The compliment clearly affected her. Not because of who he was, but because she sensed he genuinely meant it. As afternoon sunlight painted golden patterns across the floor, their conversation drifted beyond work. They spoke about childhood ambitions, favorite places in New York, and lessons learned through failure. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. When Ethan finally left the workshop, he realized something important. He had initially been curious about Ava because of a chance encounter. Now he admired her because of who she was. And as he walked toward his waiting car beneath the fading evening sky, he found himself wanting more than another meeting. He wanted another conversation. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Ava Mitchell found herself facing a reality she had avoided discussing with almost everyone in her life. The sketchbook Ethan admired so much contained more than designs. It contained a dream she had quietly carried for over a decade. A dream that had survived disappointment, financial struggles, and countless moments of self-doubt. Yet despite all her talent, she had never found the courage to fully pursue it. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan invited Ava to a small cafe overlooking the East River. The location was simple compared to the luxury restaurants he usually visited, but Ava preferred places where conversations mattered more than appearances. Sunlight reflected off the water while boats moved slowly across the river. For nearly an hour, they talked about everything from favorite childhood memories to future goals. Eventually, Ethan noticed her sketchbook resting beside her chair. "You always bring it," he said with a smile. Ava looked down at the worn cover. "It has been with me for years." Ethan took a sip of coffee. "I have seen the designs. What I have not seen is the collection you really want to create." Ava hesitated. The question touched something deeply personal. For a moment, she considered changing the subject. Instead, she opened the sketchbook and slowly turned several pages. Ethan studied the drawings carefully. The collection was unlike anything he had seen before. Elegant dresses inspired by personal journeys. Designs reflecting confidence, resilience, and transformation. Every page felt connected to a story. "These are incredible," he said quietly. Ava smiled, but there was sadness behind it. "They are also unfinished." Ethan frowned slightly. "Why?" She stared out toward the river. "Because dreams cost money. They cost time. They require people to believe in you." Her voice remained calm, but the truth beneath it was impossible to miss. "I spent years taking freelance work just to survive. Every time I got close to pursuing this collection, something happened. A client canceled. Expenses increased. Life got in the way." Ethan listened carefully. Ava rarely spoke about herself with this level of honesty. "So you gave up?" he asked gently. Ava shook her head. "No, I postponed it. There is a difference." The answer made him smile. It sounded exactly like her. Strong enough to keep going. Honest enough to admit disappointment. That evening, after returning home, Ethan could not stop thinking about the conversation. From the windows of his penthouse, Manhattan glittered beneath the evening sky. Yet his thoughts remained focused on a sketchbook filled with unrealized possibilities. Throughout his career, he had invested in buildings, companies, and ideas. Most opportunities were evaluated through spreadsheets and projections. Ava's dream felt different. It carried something far more valuable than numbers. Passion. Meanwhile, Ava spent the weekend organizing fabrics and reviewing concepts inside her Brooklyn studio. The conversation at the cafe had stirred emotions she usually kept hidden. Part of her wondered whether she had waited too long, whether her chance had already passed. Late Sunday afternoon, she discovered an envelope resting outside her studio door. Confused, she picked it up and stepped inside. The envelope contained a handwritten note. "Ava, the world has enough people who talk about dreams. It needs more people willing to chase them. Meet me tomorrow morning. Ethan." Attached to the note was an invitation to visit one of Harrison Global's newly renovated creative spaces. Ava stared at the message for several seconds. Her heart beat a little faster. She did not know exactly what Ethan had planned, but for the first time in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. And somewhere deep inside, a dream she thought had been sleeping quietly for years was beginning to wake up again. The following morning, Ava arrived at the address Ethan had provided with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. The building stood along a revitalized section of Brooklyn's waterfront, where former industrial warehouses had been transformed into creative spaces for artists, designers, and entrepreneurs. Large windows reflected the early sunlight, while the East River shimmered nearby. Ava stepped inside and immediately understood why Ethan had chosen this location. The space felt alive. Designers worked at drafting tables. Photographers reviewed portfolios. Artists discussed projects over coffee. Inspiration seemed to fill every corner. Ethan was already waiting when she arrived. Dressed in a simple navy suit rather than his usual executive attire, he looked more relaxed than she had ever seen him. "Good morning," he said with a smile. "What do you think?" Ava slowly looked around. "It is beautiful." Ethan nodded. "I thought you might like it." Together, they toured the building. Ethan explained that Harrison Global had created the space to support emerging creative talent. Unlike traditional corporate programs, the goal was not immediate profit. It was opportunity. As they walked through bright studios and collaborative workspaces, Ava felt something she had not experienced in years. Possibility. For a brief moment, her dream no longer seemed impossible. Yet while hope was growing between them, pressure was building elsewhere. News of Ethan's increasing involvement with Ava had begun circulating within social circles that closely followed the lives of powerful business leaders. At first, the conversations remained private. Then they became more direct. One evening, Ethan attended a dinner hosted by several longtime associates. The gathering took place at an exclusive Manhattan club where influential executives exchanged ideas and discussed investments. During the meal, one of the guests casually mentioned Ava. The comment seemed harmless at first. Then others joined in. Questions became assumptions. Assumptions became judgments. Ethan listened quietly as people who had never met Ava reduced her to a category. An aspiring designer. A woman from a different world. Someone they believed could never truly belong beside a man like him. For the first time in years, Ethan felt disconnected from the very people who had occupied his social circle for decades. The next day, the situation became even more complicated. A family member called to express concern. The conversation remained polite, but the message was unmistakable. People expected him to stay within certain boundaries, to make certain choices, to preserve a particular image. Ethan ended the call feeling frustrated. Throughout his career, he had built businesses by challenging assumptions and seeing value where others did not. Yet now the same people who admired his vision seemed unable to recognize the extraordinary woman standing right in front of him. Meanwhile, Ava sensed the shift without anyone needing to explain it. Invitations became less frequent. Certain conversations became awkward. She noticed subtle changes in the way some people interacted with her during industry events. None of it was openly hostile. It was simply enough to remind her that the gap between their worlds remained real. One afternoon, she sat alone inside her studio reviewing sketches when Ethan arrived unexpectedly. He immediately noticed her mood. "Something is bothering you," he said. Ava offered a small smile. "You are becoming observant." Ethan pulled up a chair. "Tell me." For several moments, she studied the sketches scattered across the table. Then she spoke honestly. "I knew this would happen eventually." Ethan understood immediately. "The opinions?" Ava nodded. "People always become uncomfortable when something does not fit their expectations." Silence settled between them. Finally, Ethan looked directly at her. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Ava raised an eyebrow. Ethan smiled. Someone brave enough to keep chasing a dream when most people would have given up. His words touched her deeply. Yet neither of them knew that the greatest test of their relationship was still waiting ahead. Spring arrived with longer days and warmer evenings. But for Ava Mitchell, the season brought a decision that felt heavier than any winter storm. During the weeks following her conversation with Ethan, she tried to focus on her work. Her sketches multiplied. New opportunities appeared through the creative space. For the first time in years, her dreams seemed within reach. Yet the closer she grew to Ethan, the more complicated everything became. The whispers continued. Industry events felt different. People who once ignored her now watched her closely. Some were curious. Others were skeptical. Ava could handle criticism directed at herself. What troubled her was seeing Ethan forced to navigate judgment simply because he chose to spend time with her. One evening, after finishing work at the studio, she remained alone long after everyone else had left. The city lights flickered beyond the windows while unfinished designs covered her table. She opened her sketchbook and slowly turned through years of ideas, hopes, and plans. Every page reminded her why she started this journey. Long before Ethan entered her life, she had promised herself something. If an opportunity ever came, she would build her future with her own hands. Not because she refused help, but because she needed to know she could stand on her own. The next morning, an email arrived that changed everything. A prestigious fashion incubator in Chicago had selected her proposal for a 6-month development program. Hundreds of designers had applied. Only a handful were accepted. The opportunity could transform her career. It was exactly the kind of chance she had dreamed about for years. Yet as she stared at the acceptance letter, happiness mixed with sadness. Because accepting it meant leaving New York, leaving the studio, leaving Ethan. That evening, they met at their favorite cafe near the river. The setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and orange. For several minutes, they talked about ordinary things. Neither seemed eager to address the reason Ava had asked to meet. Finally, she placed the acceptance letter on the table. Ethan read it carefully. A smile appeared immediately. "Ava, this is incredible." She nodded softly. "It is." Ethan looked up. "You earned this." The sincerity in his voice made the moment even harder. Ava stared at the river before speaking. "The program starts in 3 weeks." Silence settled between them. Ethan understood immediately. "Chicago." Ava nodded again. For a moment, neither spoke. The future they had quietly begun imagining suddenly felt uncertain. Finally, Ethan leaned back in his chair. "What do you want to do?" Ava smiled sadly. "I think you already know." He did. That was part of what made her extraordinary. She would never abandon her dream for comfort. She would never ask someone else to carry her future. Ethan admired that strength even as it hurt. The following days passed quickly. Preparations consumed Ava's schedule. Farewell conversations replaced planning meetings. Packing boxes replaced design presentations. Then, on her final evening in New York, she visited the creative space one last time. As the sun disappeared beyond the skyline, Ethan joined her there. The building stood quiet around them. Ava looked at the sketches pinned across the walls and smiled. "Everything started changing here." Ethan nodded. "And it is only beginning." Ava turned toward him. Emotion shimmered in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "Thank you for believing in me before I believed in myself." Ethan held her gaze. That was easy. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Ava smiled softly and walked toward the exit. As the door closed behind her, Ethan realized something with complete certainty. He had admired her talent. He had respected her courage. Somewhere along the way, he had fallen completely in love with her. And now the woman who held his heart was leaving the city. 6 months passed more quickly than either of them expected. Chicago challenged Ava in ways she had never imagined. The fashion incubator demanded excellence every day. Designers from across the country competed for limited opportunities. Long hours became normal. Revisions filled countless evenings. There were moments when exhaustion made her question everything. Yet each challenge strengthened her confidence. Little by little, the dream she had carried inside a sketchbook began transforming into reality. Throughout those months, Ethan remained a constant presence in her life. They spoke often, sometimes about work, sometimes about nothing important at all. A quick phone call after a difficult day, a message celebrating a small victory, a photograph of a sunset, shared between 2 cities. Distance changed many things, but it never weakened the connection they had built. In fact, the separation revealed how important they had become to one another. Back in New York, Ethan found himself measuring time differently. Business continued as always. Harrison Global expanded into new markets. Meetings filled his calendar. Investors requested his attention. Yet every accomplishment felt incomplete without someone to share it with. More than once, he caught himself looking at the empty chair across a conference table and imagining Ava sitting there with her sketchbook and thoughtful observations. For years, success had been enough. Now it was simply one part of a larger picture. Then one afternoon, an invitation arrived at his office. A major fashion showcase would take place in New York. The event featured only a select group of emerging designers whose collections had attracted national attention. Ethan scanned the program quickly before stopping at a familiar name. Ava Mitchell. A smile appeared immediately. Months of hard work had led to this moment. The evening of the showcase arrived beneath clear spring skies. The venue occupied a historic waterfront building transformed into a stunning runway space. Industry leaders, media representatives, and fashion executives filled the audience. Excitement buzzed through the room. Ethan took his seat near the front. Around him, conversations blended into a distant hum. His attention remained focused on the runway. The lights dimmed. Music began softly. Then the presentation started. One design followed another beneath the spotlight. Elegant silhouettes, confident details, powerful storytelling woven into every piece. Ethan recognized elements from sketches he had once seen inside a small Brooklyn studio. Dreams that existed only on paper now moved gracefully before an audience of hundreds. The collection received an enthusiastic response. Applause grew stronger with each presentation. Yet the most unforgettable moment arrived at the end. As the final model exited the runway, Ava stepped onto the stage. For a second, the audience became completely still. Then the room erupted into applause. Standing beneath the lights, Ava looked composed and confident. Not because success had changed her, because she had finally allowed the world to see who she had always been. Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of pride. The woman others had underestimated was now commanding the attention of an entire industry. When the presentation ended, guests gathered for interviews and celebrations. Across the crowded venue, Ava spotted Ethan. Their eyes met instantly. Neither needed words to understand what the moment meant. Months of sacrifice, uncertainty, and growth had brought them here. As Ava began walking toward him through the crowd, Ethan realized something important. The dream she left New York to pursue had come true. And now, for the first time, nothing stood between them except a few final steps. The applause continued long after Ava Mitchell left the runway stage. Industry leaders approached her with congratulations. Journalists requested interviews. Potential partners expressed interest in future collaborations. It was everything she had worked toward for years. Yet as she crossed the crowded venue toward Ethan Harrison, none of those things felt as important as the person waiting on the other side of the room. When she finally reached him, neither spoke immediately. Sometimes the most meaningful moments needed no introduction. Ethan simply smiled. The same sincere smile she had first seen months ago during an accidental encounter that neither of them could have predicted would change their lives. "You did it," he said softly. Ava laughed through the emotion shining in her eyes. "I almost cannot believe it." Ethan glanced toward the runway. "Believe it. Everyone else already does." They stood together while guests continued celebrating around them. For a brief moment, the noise faded into the background. Success had brought Ava exactly where she hoped to be. Yet what mattered most was knowing she had reached this moment without losing herself. She remained the same woman who carried a sketchbook everywhere, who believed stories could be told through design, and who refused to surrender her dream even when it seemed impossible. Several weeks later, Ava's collection became one of the most talked about emerging fashion projects in the country. Opportunities arrived from New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and beyond. Her career entered an entirely new chapter. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself making an important decision of his own. For years, he had allowed public expectations to shape parts of his life. People assumed they knew what kind of future he should have, what kind of relationships made sense, and what choices were appropriate for someone in his position. For the first time, he stopped listening. One evening, the Harrison Foundation hosted a large charity gala at the same Grand Lexington Hotel where everything had begun. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the ballroom. Guests filled the room with conversation and laughter. The event celebrated creative achievement, community investment, and emerging talent. Ava had been invited as an honored guest. As she entered the ballroom, memories immediately returned. The preparation rooms upstairs, the sketches, the wrong door, the unexpected beginning. So much had changed since then. Later in the evening, Ethan stepped onto the stage to deliver closing remarks. The audience quieted. He thanked sponsors, volunteers, and community leaders for supporting the foundation's mission. Then his speech took an unexpected turn. Ethan spoke about courage, about believing in people before the world recognized their value, about dreams that survived despite obstacles. Many guests assumed he was discussing entrepreneurship. Ava knew better. Finally, Ethan looked directly toward her. "The most important lesson I learned this year is that extraordinary people often appear when you least expect them," he said. The room listened carefully. "And sometimes the greatest mistake you can make is allowing fear, status, or other people's opinions to decide who deserves a place in your life." Silence filled the ballroom. Not uncomfortable silence. Meaningful silence. Then Ethan stepped away from the podium and walked toward Ava. Nothing dramatic followed. No spectacle. No performance. Just honesty. The kind that mattered most. As hundreds of guests watched, he offered his hand. Ava smiled and accepted it. The applause that followed felt different from the applause at the fashion showcase. This celebration was not about success. It was about authenticity. About choosing what mattered. Later that night, they stood together on a balcony overlooking Manhattan. The city lights stretched endlessly beneath the stars. Ava rested her hands on the railing and smiled. "It is funny," she said softly. "All of this happened because someone opened the wrong door." Ethan laughed. Maybe it was the right door all along. Together they watched the skyline glow in the distance. Two people from different worlds. Two dreams that found each other unexpectedly. And as the city sparkled beneath the night sky, both understood a simple truth. The most unforgettable stories are never the ones we plan. They are the ones that find us when we least expect them.